My name is Ciara Ennis. This is going to be a very different kind of presentations to the one that you've just seen. It's a lot more formal because I'm going to read it, but please stay with me. And before I go on, I just want to say a very big thank you to Robert and to Stephen and to Badui, wherever she is.
She went outside.
Oh, okay. But thanks a lot for organizing this, and thank you very much for inviting me to take part. And also to say that I think we already have a Museum of Awe, and I think that's the museum I'm going to talk about right now. And I think that Jim Carter should be in that museum. So perhaps he already is, but maybe, I don't know. Okay.
Jim's books are for sale at the MJT.
He what?
Jim's books are for sale at the MJT.
Of course.
And his whole charts and periodic tables.
That's amazing, that table. Incredible. Okay. So over the past 30 years, contemporary exhibition strategy has excavated and redeployed the 17th century museum model of the wunderkammer. Curators and artists in museums, biennials, and in solo artist presentations have appropriated the floor-to-ceiling display, diversity and density of objects, rich interdisciplinary focus, inclusion of non-artworks, and vast historical scope of this model. This contemporary co-option provides a critical alternative to the rigid codes and conventions governing exhibition practices that have dominated museums since the early 1900s. Although the widespread use of these methodologies might suggest that the wunderkammer aesthetic has entered the mainstream and as a result can no longer function as a radical critique, there are vast differences in how this aesthetic has been exerted and to what critical effect. This paper examines a museum that is one of the most effective contemporary embodiments of the wunderkammer, the Museum of Jurassic Technology, or MJT, in Los Angeles, and traces its relationship to England's first public museum, the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. For the past 29 years, the MJT has occupied a modest storefront on Venice Boulevard in Culver City. Over the years, it has expanded to incorporate part of an adjoining building, a former forensic laboratory warehousing biopsy tissue and body parts, and is now repurposed as a gallery displaying floral radiographs. The museum comprises 10 small galleries spread over 2 floors. Additionally, there is the Borzoi Cabinet Theatre, a modestly sized cinema with 14 seats. Although I couldn't actually get a slide of the theatre, but this is just outside it, and just to the right of the piano is the entrance to the theatre. A tea room modelled after Tsar Nicholas II's study at the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, a library with a large selection of books dedicated to Napoleon Bonaparte, and a rooftop garden with resident doves. Prior to 1988, the MJT functioned as a nomadic entity. However, in its permanent site in Culver City, it has channeled in appearance, atmosphere, and content the encyclopedic nature of early museums. Dramatic wunderkammer mise-en-scène is employed from its dimly lit passageways and labyrinthine floor plan to the sound of mournful Baroque cantatas. A quote from Charles Wilson Peale, who founded his own encyclopedic museum a century after the Ashmolean in 1786, greets the viewers as they enter and encapsulates the spirit of the MJT. Quote, "The learner must be led away from familiar objects towards the unfamiliar, guided along, as it were, by a chain of flowers into the mysteries of life." One of the first exhibits encountered acts as an induction. Entitled The First Natural History Museum, a model of Noah's Ark features a cutaway that reveals a complex interior of multiple floors and cubicles. Based on Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher's 1675 etching of the biblical ark, the display acts as a symbolic prototype for an encyclopedic collection. Through a variety of approaches, the MJT's exhibits and displays signal disparate time periods and museum genres. While several installations channel the didacticism and visual language of natural history museums, complete with audience-activated dioramas and facsimiles of natural specimens housed in traditional wood and glass vitrines, others focus on idiosyncratic collections. These include the Garden of Eden on wheels, a collection of 5 miniature mobile homes, the letters of amateur astronomers written to scientists at Mount Wilson Observatory, Pasadena, an arrangement of caps, cradle string structures, and kaleidoscopic miniatures made from butterfly wings. Although buried under layers of questionable historical references and anecdotal detail, allusions to the Ashmoleans' founding narrative is pervasive in the MJT's account of its own history. Reputedly, the founding collection was donated to the MJT by Mary Rose Cannon, a resident of Pasadena, California, who inherited the collection from the grandfather she never knew, Jared Bilius. According to the narrative, Bilius inveigled the collection from Owen Thumb and his son, botanists living in southwestern Nebraska, who had amassed the extensive collection during the 1920s and 30s. Of particular interest was a selection of dinosaur fossils deriving from the Jurassic period. Other objects include an assemblage of extinct 19th century French moths, Native American cradle drains used to extract urine from children's cots, as well as a gold-bedecked stuffed ermine. However, many of these founding objects, including the fossils which inspired the museum's name, have never been on view at the Los Angeles Museum. Instead, they reside in the Ernst Osthaus Museum in Hagen, Germany, where they are now deinstalled and in storage. As has been extensively documented, the seed collection of the Ashmolean Museum derived from the Ark, a wunderkammer developed by John Tradescant and his son, who amassed a collection of rare objects and flora and fauna samples in the early 1600s, while in service to patrons at the highest level of English aristocracy. These objects and specimens were exhibited in a house and garden known as the Ark, which is open to the public for a small fee, about the price of a packet of butter. As suggested by the emphasis on the biographic, both the Tradescant and Thumb father and son teams are critical to the foundation narratives of their respective museums, and as such feature prominently in their institution's literature. In the case of the Tradescants, their contributions to the Ashmolean Museum have been extensively researched and written about, most frequently by scholar and former Ashmolean keeper Arthur McGregor. Of particular relevance here is Tradescant's Rarities, which in addition to comprising texts on the Tradescants' histories, included a record of remaining objects from the Ark. Published in 1983 to mark the Ashmoleans' tricentennial, McGregor's book, in addition to revealing the singular history, is also responsible for providing the conceptual seed for the formation of the MJT. In 2002, the MJT published its own anniversary catalogue, allegedly celebrating their Jubilee year, a date that bears no relation to the founding of the museum in 1988. Although slight in comparison to McGregor's book, the Jubilee catalogue follows a similar format, with text and an inventory of MJT's permanent collection. However, it is the essay, The Thumbs, Gardeners and Botanists, Hagen, Germany, tucked away in the appendix, which reveals the MJT's considerable depth to McGregor's scholarship. Although greatly abbreviated and set in the 20th century, there can be no doubt that the Thumb's history is analogous to that of the Tradescants, as articulated in McGregor's opening essay in Tradescant's Rarities. So that's Owen the Thumb Elder on the left and Owen the Thumb the Younger on the right. Transferred from England to America's Midwest, the Thumb's narrative painstakingly mimics that of the Tradescants, complete with uncanny parallels, astute omissions, skewed facts, and altered names, locations, and dates. Just as there is some dispute over the Tradescants' birthplace, some trace its origins to the Netherlands, there is comparable confusion concerning the Elder Thumb, who may have hailed from Montana instead of Nebraska. Names of principal characters in Tradescants' histories, such as notable employers and associates and family members, have been replaced with American-sounding aliases. Elias Ashmole becomes Jared Bilius. Robert Cecil, the Earl of Salisbury, is replaced by a Mrs. Betty Gerber of Platteville. Lord Wotton of St. Augustine's Palace at Canterbury is remade as Miss Nellie Wotton of Eustis, County Nebraska. And Hester Pooks, Tradescant the Younger's wife, who disputed Ashmole's ownership of the Ark and later drowned under suspicious circumstances in her garden pond, becomes Hester Boxbutte, and so on. Although rich in drama and intrigue, the biographies of the Thumbs pale into comparison to that of the Tradescants, which involved sea voyages to distant lands, military sieges, assassinations of dukes, mysterious demises, theft, and greed. Despite reading like an 18th century adventure novel, the Tradescants' histories are hardly questioned. It is not just the stamp of Oxford University that validates this improbable story, but the institutional authority of the museum itself, which authenticates all that passes through its doors. As art historians Carol Duncan and Alan Wallach have explored, it is not just the museum's collection and mechanisms of display that assert authority, but the architectural frame, which in the case of the Ashmolean is a neoclassical structure that serves to connect the museum to the traditions of the past while underscoring its continued relevance to the present. While the same cannot be said of the MJT's facade, which elicits contradictory signs, the museum deploys other representational strategies which bolsters its questionable founding history. However, while doubt lingers as to the veracity of the Thumbs, some may be aware of Lawrence Weschler's expose in Mr. Wilson's Cabinet of Curiosities, which Margaret mentioned today. Questions concerning their authenticity does not diminish the credibility of the MJT, but instead provokes larger questions about the politics of facticity and fiction that go unchallenged in those museums. As such, David Wilson's co-opting of the Tradescant narrative could be understood as a work of parafiction, which, as theorist Carrie Lambert-Beatty explains, is a site where, quote, real and or imaginary personages and stories intersect with the real world as it is being lived. These fictions are experienced as fact. They are truth status. However, the deception played out on the viewer is not for the idle amusement of the artist, or in this case, the museum director, but is instead critical in its intent. The museum, like any other institute, articulates a power structure with clearly defined hierarchies and systems of exclusions and inclusions. The projected narratives, mechanisms of display, and choice of exhibits all contributes to the museum's ideological agenda that relies on the authority already vested in the institution to legitimate its form and content. It is the museum's presumed neutrality that Wilson's MJT attempts to unveil. As Lambert-Beatty states, the crucial skill for parafiction is stylistic mimicry, which allows the radical content of the work, or in this case the museum, to be considered, and it is this aspect that Wilson performs so well. Staged on one hand by recreating the mise-en-scène and visual language of a traditional museum, and on the other by populating it with unconventional exhibits that defy expectations within the contemporary museum context. This conventional framing of unconventional subject matter elicits a sense of unease, as the viewer is prompted to question with greater scrutiny what it is they are actually seeing. Reminiscent of Bertolt Brecht's defamiliarization technique, where the familiar is made strange, the MJT's exhibits force a reconsideration of how museums manage and construct meaning through their exhibitions and display. References to the Ark and early days of the Ashmolean are also embroidered into the MJT's introductory video, which deliberately conflates names, confuses facts, and conceals sources. The Museum Wormianum 1655 is erroneously located in London instead of Denmark, and the Ark is falsely attributed to Elias Ashmole. Accompanying the voiceover are reproductions of other notable institutions, such as Imparato della Historia Naturale from 1599, Lagatti's Museo Cospiano from 1677, and an interior view of the Leiden Anatomy Theatre from 1610, which flash up on the screen without explanation as to what they are or their significance to the museum's history. The provenance of other images is equally obscured through a process of montage, where image and narrated texts, which bear no relation to each other, are presented as fact. In one such instance, a drawing of a circumcision tool reproduced from Christopher Stern's diary after a visit to Tradescant's Ark in 1638 is juxtaposed with the 9th century Abbey of Corby, which his voiceover explains boasts a hair from Noah's beard. Despite the fact that Corby Abbey was founded in the 7th century, without knowledge of Stern's drawing, one is left to conclude that the circumcision tool is in fact a hair from Noah's beard. As art historian Donald Preziosi has written, one of the principal products of museum stagecraft is a belief in the independent existence and agency of what its objects are taken as signifying, which, as the above example shows, is clearly false. In addition to providing an authoritative and credible history for the MJT, both the founding narrative and introductory video serve as a critique of conventional museological procedures. Such customary devices are part of the ideological toolkit of all museums, which deploy familiar technologies, theatrical lighting, display techniques, audiovisual aids, didactics, and authoritative voiceovers to manage identities and convey specific agendas. As art historian Bruce Ferguson has written, these devices emphasize, de-emphasize, and re-emphasize braided narratives with purpose, fictions of persuasion, docudramas of influence. All are contributive to the ways in which art is more or less understood, or in this case of the MJT, where meaning is thwarted. The diagram titled The Siege and Battle of Pavia is a case in point. Painted directly onto the wall, the schematic depicts only the names of the surrounding towns, but reveals nothing about the events of the battle that took place in 1525. As a result, it is completely meaningless, unless one has extensive knowledge of the conflict and its significance to Spanish military hegemony in the 16th century. Similarly, a large plexiglass didactic panel is equally disconcerting. The left side of the panel includes a detailed caption of Portrait of an Unknown Young Lady, number 285, while the right side depicts, in diagrammatic form, various examples of picture frame construction. Both the map and caption are without context and therefore impossible to make sense of unless one is intimately familiar with the inventory and plate section of McGregor's book, from where these incomplete references have been pulled. Although the content and meaning of these exhibits is beyond comprehension, the display technologies ensure that the legitimacy of these texts goes unquestioned. By staging these disconnected narratives, Wilson underscores the power of museum stagecraft to validate even the most ambiguous of narratives. So, what significance does the MJT's co-option of Ashmolean's founding narrative have? Does it matter that many of the exhibits are fictitious, or that they have been copied from object descriptions in Tradescant's rarities? What possible value does this act of mimicry have? As evidenced throughout this paper, the profusion of veiled references to the Ashmolean's founding narrative has provided the MJT with a credible history, an authoritative mantle. Traditional mechanisms of display, wood and glass vitrines, didactics, and audiovisual devices further reinforce the idea of a bona fide museum, despite the dubious truth status of many of the exhibits. These experiments in dissimulation, as Karen Lambert-Beatty has described as parafictional projects, cause viewers to, quote, wonder uncomfortably about the status of the claims the exhibition made, or go away in a strange kind of educated ignorance. Their worldviews subtly altered, perhaps in truthful ways, by untruths. This is precisely what happens at the MJT, where fictions presented as fact cast doubt on factual displays, so that questions as to how museums construct the managed meaning come to the fore. However, Wilson's MJT is not purely an exercise in museological critique, but a genuine attempt to reintroduce another model, where the merging of diverse disciplines, belief systems, and practitioners are given equal weight. Since the emerging of universal survey museums in the late 18th century, such expansive visions have been edited out of the museum experience and replaced with a different regime, where strict divisions between disciplines and subject categories were enforced. comparatively rigid in its effects, such a system, enhanced by its uniform mechanisms of display, was designed to instill particular forms of knowledge. In contrast, the MJT's exhibits, which span centuries, practices, and beliefs, inspire an unusual engagement. As a result, this rousing of intense curiosity, in concert with the interdisciplinary nature and unexpected juxtaposition of exhibits, encourages a different kind of knowledge production, associative rather than linear, and unhampered by familiar habits of thought. Such aspects link the MJT to a moment in museum history, exemplified by Tradescant's art and the early days of the Ashmolean, when hierarchies between disciplines, practitioners, and objects were not so clearly defined. Thank you.